It hasn't even been a day since I first laid eyes upon it. I was dropping my girlfriend off for her last in-person yoga class before everything went back on lockdown for the winter. When a portrait hanging in the display window of the shop across the street unexpectedly caught my attention. It was an 18-inch by 24-inch expressionist painting of a black humanoid creature with poorly defined edges and features, like it was bleeding into the shadows around it. It was tall, gaunt, and hunched, dressed in a tattered hood and mantle that vaguely resembled a set of wings. It lacked all facial features save for a pair of misty white eyes, the only part of its body that wasn't black. It held a lumpy sack in one hand, and in the other, it plucked up a child between two of its long, Dr. Seuss-esque fingers. The child was bruised and bloodied, and undeniably terrified for its life. But no motive could be inferred from the stance of its tormentor. The whole scene was reminiscent of Saturn devouring his children, only with Saturn reimagined as some sort of Lovecraftian boogeyman. My interest sufficiently piqued, I decided to go inside for a closer look. The shop in question was Orville's old-fashioned oddity outlet, and was mildly infamous for selling strange items of questionable authenticity. Ever since I had started taking my girlfriend to the neighboring Eve's Eden of Esoteria, I often found myself wondering how old Orville managed to stay in business. His oddity shop rarely seemed busy, and from what I could tell, most people agreed that his merchandise was overpriced hokum. It could have been that Orville was living off an inheritance or something, and was operating his business at a loss for the hell of it, or that the runoff from Eve's was enough to keep him afloat. But a quick glance at the local paranormal forum, HorwickHollows.net, produced photographs of some of the town's wealthiest residents visiting the shop, along with a handful of other mysterious figures who nobody recognized. Everything from cloaked cultists to colorful clown girls had been seen making after-hours visits to Orville's. So maybe, just maybe, a few of Orville's high-end items were legit, and the occasional sale to his select clientele was all he needed to stay in business. It was a fun little thought as I stepped through the door, paying no heed to the large caveat emptor emblazoned upon it. VHS tapes? What am I supposed to do with VHS tapes? I heard a gruff voice ask. I looked towards it and saw an old man in a garish pastel suit with his feet up on his desk and a phone in his hand. With his other hand, he indicated that he would be with me in a moment. Nobody has a VCR anymore. You have a VCR to go with the tape collection? What's its deal? Of course, you can't set the clock. There's nothing paranormal about that. Listen, what are you trying to sell? The tapes or what's on the tapes? Because if it's what's on the tapes, then maybe you could... Well, I'll never be able to move them as a general item. I have to convince people to buy an obsolete VCR to go with them. Might be able to broker a deal with a specific buyer. I'd need more information. No, not now though. Well, I got a customer. I'll call you back. No, I said no. If you put a piece of Scotch tape over the removed tab, you could tape over it again. If there's tape residue, then you could have taped it over, but it could have just been from an old label. How would I know? Yeah, you figure that out. I gotta go. Okay, bye. He hung up the receiver on the cradle of a bronzed and mahogany rotary phone before folding his fingers and giving me his full attention. Honestly, things some of these jerks try to unload on me, he said with a roll of his eyes. Anywho, can I help you find anything, young man? Yeah, actually. I was wondering about that painting in the window, I replied, pointing to the display behind me. Oh, that's a self-portrait of Rancorous Ruck. The old man flashed me a devious smile before donning an iridescent tragedy mask with a surgical mask fixed to the inside. Self-portrait? I asked skeptically. Absolutely, he said, rising from his seat and leading me towards the painting. Cryptids and monsters are notoriously difficult to get decent photographs of, and that was a bit of a problem for old Rancor here. Well, he can't exist in the real world unless he already exists in the mind of a suitable host, let's say. He's sustained by thoughts about him. He uses his host's innate mental energy to manifest a physical form for himself. This presents a bit of a catch-22 since he needs people to know about him to exist, but existing is kind of a prerequisite for people to know about you. What's a damn thought form to do? Well, If you're a thought-based murder monster like Rancorous Ruck here, you leave a self-portrait behind as a calling card. And that way, even after your host is pushing up daisies, another one's bound to come along sooner or later and end up getting you stuck in their head. He took the portrait down from the easel and allowed me to get a better look at it, taking care not to look at it himself. The first thing I noticed was the lumps of the sack were much more clearly hands or feet, or faces, pushing through it from the inside. The bottom of the sack was wet and dripping with a dark red fluid, presumably blood, and the background showed many small sets of footprints running rapidly in all directions. Finally, in the corner, I could make the signature of the artist in the same stark white as the creature's eyes. Rancorous Ruck, self-portrait, September 1947. So you're claiming that the creature in the portrait is the artist, and it leaves these paintings behind as a way to infect other victims? I asked incredulously. That's right. And anyone with a lick of sense or concern for their fellow human beings burns them. So they're very rare, Orville replied. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why in the world would anyone pay $1,300 for a cursed painting? $1,300? Now, before taxes, various fees, surcharges, yes. Now, the reason is that since old Rancor is sustained by your thoughts, you're able to exert some control over how he manifests. The more you study the portrait, the more rancorous you take into yourself. And, if you're strong enough, the more of him you can bend to your will, potentially very useful, or, life-saving if he decides to come after you. Which he probably will, since you've taken such an interest in his handiwork. Good luck getting him out of your head now. Seriously, though, your best bet is buying the painting, studying every square inch of it until your eyes are bloodshot, put in some eye drops, and keep studying. I was more than a little confused by Orville's sales pitch of buy this possessed painting in the hopes of inoculating yourself against the demon. I didn't really believe him, but I did find the story mildly entertaining. As for the painting itself, I genuinely liked it. It was delightfully macabre, and I was curious about why the artist would have titled it a self-portrait. I could tell that it was an actual painting and not a print, so even though I would have liked some actual provenance on the piece, $1,300 wasn't an outrageous asking price for a decent work by an unknown artist. As much as I hated myself for it, I ended up buying the damn thing, which came to almost $1,600 with all of Orville's taxes, fees, and surcharges. He wrapped it up very carefully, still taking the greatest of care not to look at it himself, and helped me Tetris it into the trunk of my car. I didn't want my girlfriend to see it, not because I was afraid of the curse, but because I was afraid of her cursing me out. Fortunately, when she came out of Eve's, she put her bags in the back seat instead of the trunk. I didn't really have a plan for what I would have said if she had opened the trunk, but I got lucky. That was a fight we could save for another day. Once I had taken her home and gotten back to my own apartment, for some reason I took Orville's advice and carefully inspected the painting before hanging it up. It didn't make any sense, though, since there wasn't really anything to study. Rancorous Ruck was just a shadow person. There didn't seem much more I could learn just by looking at him. If I squinted, I thought that maybe I could make out the outline of a belt, ragged sleeves, or the tattered hem of his hood. But that was it. I stared into the empty void of his face, thinking that if there was any hidden details, that was where I'd find it. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything other than those two white eyes. Since my thorough examination of the piece failed to yield any hidden secrets, I felt comfortably reassured that Orville had been full of crap. I even googled Rancorous Ruck and got 0 results, which seemed a crushing blow to Orville's claim that there had been multiple paintings by an artist using that pseudonym. I was convinced the painting was a one-off by an unknown artist that had somehow found its way to Orville's shop, and he made up a story to go with it, as he did for all of his wares. I did vaguely recall seeing something about a red ruck in the Harrowick Harrows forum, but I didn't think too much about it. I figured both were drawing inspiration from the same local legend. I tried taking a photo of the portrait with my phone and uploading it to the forum. And that's when things got weird. But when I looked at the portrait through my phone, Ruck was nothing but an amorphous black cloud. There was nothing humanoid about his form at all. The white bits that had been his eyes were now clearly just breaks in the cloud. I fiddled around with the settings and even the lighting in my room, but nothing could make Rancorous Ruck appear on the screen the way he did in the portrait. This got even more unsettling when I tried to take a photo or record a video. Each and every time, the file wouldn't save, no matter what I did. I tried saving it to the device, the SD card, the cloud, nothing worked. At this point, I was starting to get a little freaked out, but there were still rational explanations to explore before accepting Orville's cockamamie story. Like maybe the portrait wasn't from 1947 at all, but was far more modern, and embedded with some machine-readable code for digital rights management. But that wasn't really how something like that would work, was it? I would get a notification telling me I didn't have the rights to share the image. It wouldn't just inexplicably be unable to save the file, and it clearly wouldn't automatically censor it the way that it was doing. Could it have been for a joke or marketing scheme then? That still would have been required getting some software onto my phone somehow. Maybe my phone was infected with malware, and it was just a coincidence that the first thing I tried to take a photo of was this creepy painting. It's pretty much all I could think of, aside from the obvious theories about losing my marbles. Frustrated, I tossed my phone aside and leaned in to examine the portrait once again, to see if I could find anything that might explain the incongruity between what I was seeing and what the camera on my phone saw. I found myself staring into Ruck's eyes. The eyes that my phone said were nothing more than empty spaces in a shiftless black form. But they were too deliberately placed and shaped to be anything but eyes. And had been painted very distinct white to contrast with the darkness around them, making their presence undeniable. I could even make out the form outline of pupils and irises, though I hadn't noticed them before. In fact, now that I was really looking at them, I could see that they even had corneas, each of which held the reflection of a vague, ghostly figure. It was astonishing, actually, how much detail had gone into the eyes that would only be noticed up close. But then I was really starting to wish my girlfriend had discovered the painting. At least then I'd had a rational excuse to take it back to Orville's. Not that he would have taken it back. He was very clear that the only thing about his shop that wasn't real was his return policy. I tried convincing myself that I was being silly. The whole reason I bought the painting was because it was creepy, and if I had spent as much money on my phone as I had of it, maybe I'd be able to take a decent picture of it. Sighing in defeat, I resigned myself to living with the portrait for at least one night. I mean, if it was still a problem in the light of day, I tried to pawn it off on some gallery or museum for a tax deduction. Sleep, unsurprisingly, eluded me that night. Have you heard of the Tetris effect? It's when you have residual imagery of something that you were really focused on, either in the dark or in your peripheral vision. As I laid in the dark that night, I could see Rancorous Ruck. At first it was just his eyes floating in the darkness, his body as amorphous as it had been on my phone, but gradually he started to take shape. His head, his hood, his mantle, then his limbs, his torso. Finally his sack, they all slowly emerged as distinct from the surrounding darkness, and I could see him as clearly as if I was looking at his portrait. The child, however, did not appear, leaving Ruck with a free hand. He held up his long fingers to his face to examine them. I thought nothing of it, dismissing it as more of a hypnagogic imagery. Then he lowered his hand. He looked towards me, and a smile made of nothing more than a bright white line broke out across his face. He set his sack on the ground and began noisily rummaging through it. And as I drifted off to sleep, I remember thinking that it was very odd that a residual image on my retina should be able to make any noise at all. It was still night when I awoke again. Still dark, but I could immediately tell something was wrong. My bedroom door was open when I knew that I had it closed, and light was leaking in through the crack when I knew that I turned all the lights off. Panicking, I bolted out of bed and dashed into the living room, ready to confront any intruders with only my bare fists. My machismo vanished pretty quickly when I saw what was waiting for me in that room. In the sepia light of candles that I didn't own, I saw the hunched figure of Rancorous Ruck, working ardently at another self-portrait. His back was turned to me, and thus the painting was facing my direction. He had drawn himself emerging out of an inky black patch of mold on an old brick wall, wrapping his hand around the mouth of his victim, while brandishing a knife in the other, and even though his victim's face was mostly covered by his hand, there wasn't the slightest doubt in my mind that it was supposed to be me. He turned around to face me then. His face nothing more than 2 white dots, and a smile against an impenetrable black void. He held up his brush, heavy with paint that he carelessly let drip to the floor, and moved silently to the side so I could get a better view of his work. "I don't think I got your eyes quite right, boy," he mocked in a raspy voice. "Hope you can live with that." I didn't respond. Hell, I barely heard him. My heart was pounding so hard. My veins were flooded with adrenaline, but I couldn't will my limbs to move. I was practically catatonic, sweating and shivering as I just stared wide-eyed at the monster painting in my living room. Ruck just snickered in contempt, turning his attention back to his painting and adding a few finishing touches. Only then, when his back was turned and I thought I actually had a chance, did I run. I ran to my apartment door and I threw it open, only to see old Rancor casually standing in the doorframe, blocking my path. "Hello," he smirked, with an exaggerated wave of his long, mangly fingers. "Yes, Dr. Seuss-esque is what you called them, if I'm not mistaken. A colorful description, I must admit, even if it's not exactly what I was going for." I slammed the door shut, but it just went right through them, and he somehow moved up slightly so that I had just shut him into the apartment with me. And I had 2 choices then. Either fight him head on or try to reach the fire escape. For absolutely nothing remotely resembling a rational motive, I tried to throttle him and tackle him to the ground. And before I could even make contact, though, he slipped behind me with an ethereal ease and leapt upon my back, putting me into a chokehold and muffling my screams with his hand. I frantically tried to buck him off, slamming him against the wall, rolling upon the floor, but he clung to me with a dauntless and uncanny tenacity. It didn't take long for me to exhaust my oxygen supply like that, and I quickly lost consciousness. I wasn't dead, though. Not yet. I awoke at my desk, tied to my chair with my laptop booted up and placed in front of me. It was still night. I probably wasn't out for more than a few minutes. I began frantically looking around for my attacker, and sure enough, he was standing over me with his arms crossed, waiting patiently for me to wake up. "What the fuck are you?" I demanded, struggling against my binding vaults on the verge of hyperventilation. "Exactly what Orville told you. Or at least, close enough that it's not worth going over again," he replied. He bent over and picked up his soggy, dripping sack, and I could see slowly writhing faces, hands, and other body parts pushing against it from the inside, moaning in dull anguish as they thrashed within their burlap prison. "See this? In here are all the minds of my old victims, and they're what keeps me going when the world forgets about me. You're going in there too, but not just yet. I have a small favor to ask of you first." "Fuck you!" I cursed, vehemently spitting at him. He backhanded me so hard my chair toppled over. I was too out of it for a second to notice him putting me back up, but apparently he did, because when I came back to my senses, I was looking at my computer again. Orville was right, you know. Your thoughts sustain me, so all you have to do is to beat me with not thinking of me as a monster," he taunted, his smile twisting into a jagged white scrawl of chalk as he squeezed my cheeks with his prickly, slimy fingers. "A shame that's easier said than done. Now, you've managed to make one non-trivial contribution to my being, though, aside from my Seuss fingers. You couldn't find a single search result when you've Googled me, and in this day and age, one needs an online presence if one hopes to get anywhere. So here's the deal. I'm gonna paint, and you're gonna write. And if you come up with something postable by the time I finish my painting, you'll get the privilege of going into my sack in one piece. But if you refuse... He held his sack up to my face and pulled it open. Inside was an endless abyss of severed limbs, flayed skins, decapitated heads, scalped faces, all of them still animate and aware. The worst of all, most of them looked like they had come from children. He snapped the bag shut again. Then I tried to muster up the courage to tell him to fuck off again, but I couldn't. And so, I'm writing this. Rancorous Ruck's debut post to the interweb, exposing him to a bigger audience than his paintings ever could. I don't know if something written by someone else will infect people the same way his paintings do, but I really hope they don't. But if this post really does infect people, then please know I am truly sorry. The bastard's in my head now. I'm not strong enough to resist him. Once I post this, I'm gonna be in the sack. And maybe you think that's what I deserve for going into Rancor's demands. But if you pity me at all, and you ever happen to be in Sombermery, then please, please, do me one favor. Burn Orville's shop to the ground. Good evening, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. If you guys take a look in the description down below, you'll find some neat stuff. Particularly, I use a lot of links there that'll take you over to the author's Reddits, as well as if the author has written any kinds of books, or you'd like to find more from any of the authors that we've done stories for, you can find their info in the description. I know it's not very YouTube-like to look down there, but I'd really appreciate it if you did. And of course, I want to give a very, very, very big shout out to all of my followers on Patreon, especially Bloodlace, Peter Bowie, AcidSystem, F, Alan Hyper, Brennan Matthews, Mary Massacre, Janine Hook, Paul Livingston, Seth Joseph Richards, Ashlyn, Deadeye Nick, Azad Hosenbokus, Rick Dance, Bryce Charles, Luminen Walker, Sheri Morgan, Jake Mcnee, Victoria Helton, BDH9294, Melinda S, Phinney, Nathan, Dante Rowe, Jane Rennalls, acebandg, Ryan Kellum, Bobby J. CAVANAUGH, Barbara Biggs, BellaBailey, Ninja Grace, Dad Obsessed Trash, Suzanne Grow, Tommy Walters, Tater Chip, Onbu Op Willie, Sarah Gree, Yuri Catslash, Randy, Brad Gustafson, Sean Tristan Markham, B. Lisa Tyser, Jose Rodriguez, Adagio Rose, Peaceful Buddha, Azarine Fox, Freddy Krueger, Ho Gunkchi, Justin Johnson, King Hades F13, Michael Scarborough, James Lowe, Someone You Love, Nina Smith, Rafael Rodriguez, and Chance Burnett. You guys, as always, are the real MVP, and I can't thank you enough for helping me get to where I am now and, generally keeping me alive. So thank you all so much for supporting on Patreon. Thank you everybody in the description for supporting on Patreon. And thank you everybody out there who's listening and watching somewhere across the many reaches of the internet. Have a good night and sweet dreams.